The door of the great hall opened with a sound like thunder, and every eye in the room turned toward Elena Hartley as she stepped inside, wearing a pale blue dress that suddenly felt too heavy for her body. She did not know yet that this night would break something inside her that could never be put back the same way again. She only knew that Damian Cross, the Alpha King of the Northern Packs, had summoned her, and when a king summons someone, they do not refuse. The hall was full of wolves from every corner of the territory. Candlelight flickered along the stone walls, and the smell of pine and smoke hung in the air. Elena walked slowly, her heart pounding so hard she was sure the people closest to her could hear it. She had waited 3 years for this moment. 3 years since the bond between her and Damian had first appeared, a thin silver thread that only mates could feel, pulling her heart toward his, even when he stood on the other side of a crowded room. She had told herself, again and again, that patience was a virtue, that kings had duties, that someday he would turn to her in front of everyone and claim her as his mate, the way the old stories described it, with warmth and pride and unshaken certainty. She pictured his hand reaching for hers, his voice steady as he told the world that she belonged beside him. That was not what happened. Damian stood at the top of the stone steps, dressed in black and silver, his shoulders set in the hard, commanding way that made every wolf in the room straighten their spine. He did not smile when he saw her. His jaw was tight, his eyes distant, like a man reading from a script he had memorized but did not believe. Beside him stood Claire Whitfield, the daughter of a powerful pack from the eastern border, her golden hair pinned high, her expression calm and satisfied, like a woman who already knew how this evening would end. Elena stopped at the bottom of the steps. The room went quiet. Damian's voice, when it came, was flat and cold, carrying easily through the silent hall. "Elena Hartley," he said, "you are not my mate. I release you from the bond. My alliance will be formed through my marriage to Claire Whitfield of the Eastern Pack." For a moment, Elena could not understand the words. They floated somewhere above her, refusing to land. Then the meaning arrived all at once, like cold water poured over her head, and the pain came with it, sharp and sudden, tearing through her chest exactly where the silver thread of the bond had always lived. A rejection was not just words. It was a wound that every wolf in the room could feel, a break in the bond that rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. Elena's knees buckled slightly, and she caught herself against the cold stone railing beside her. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman gasped. Someone else whispered her name. Damian did not move to help her. He stood at the top of the steps like a statue, his eyes fixed somewhere over her head, refusing to look directly at her, as if looking at her would cost him something he could not afford to pay. Elena straightened her back. She would not fall apart in front of these people. She would not give Claire Whitfield the satisfaction of watching her cry. She lifted her chin, and though her voice shook, she made herself speak clearly enough for the room to hear. "Then I release you as well," she said. "I want nothing from a king who cannot look me in the eye." A murmur passed through the crowd. It was a rare thing, for a rejected mate to answer with pride instead of tears. Elena did not wait to see how the room reacted. She turned and walked out of the hall, her steps steady, even though her whole body wanted to shake apart. Outside, the night air was sharp and cold, and Elena finally let herself breathe. She walked past the guards at the gate, past the rows of stone cottages where pack members lived their ordinary lives, past the training yards where she had once watched Damian spar with his warriors, and felt something like hope bloom quietly in her chest. All of that hope was gone now, burned away in the space of a few cruel sentences. She reached the small house at the edge of the packlands that she shared with her closest friend, Grace Bennett. Grace was waiting at the door, her face pale with worry, because word of what had happened inside the hall always traveled faster than the person it happened to. "Elena," Grace said, reaching for her, "what did he say to you?" Elena did not answer right away. She walked past Grace into the small kitchen and set her hands flat on the wooden table, trying to steady herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but certain. "He rejected me," she said, "in front of everyone." Then he announced his marriage to Claire Whitfield in the same breath. Grace's mouth fell open. "He wouldn't. Not like that. Not without even speaking to you first." "He did," Elena said. And I am done waiting for a man who sees me as an inconvenience to his politics. Grace sat down slowly across from her, searching her face. What are you going to do? Elena looked toward the small window, where the shapes of the pine trees stood black against the night sky, and beyond them, far in the distance, the darker line of forest that everyone in the territory knew by name but avoided by instinct, the Forbidden Lands, a place where the old boundary markers still stood, warning travelers to turn back. A place where, generations ago, a terrible battle had driven the ancient magic wild, and no pack had claimed the land since. I'm leaving, Elena said. Tonight. Grace's eyes went wide. Leaving where? You cannot mean the Forbidden Lands. Elena, nobody who goes in ever comes back the same. I don't care, Elena said, and for the first time since she had walked out of the hall, her voice cracked slightly, revealing the pain underneath her calm. I cannot stay here and watch him build a life with someone else. I cannot walk past that hall every day and remember how it felt to stand there while he refused to even look at me. I need to be somewhere that isn't filled with him. Grace reached across the table and took her hands. Then let me come with you. Elena shook her head. No, this pack needs you. Your family needs you. This is something I have to do alone. They argued for a while longer, the way close friends do, when one of them is about to do something reckless. But in the end, Grace understood that nothing would change Elena's mind. She helped her pack a small bag instead, filling it with warm clothes, a knife, dried food, and a small pouch of silver coins that Grace insisted she take, even though Elena protested. By the time the moon had climbed high above the tree line, Elena stood at the edge of the pack territory, looking out at the dark shape of the forest ahead. Behind her lay everything she had ever known. Ahead of her lay a land that swallowed travelers whole and returned nothing but rumors. She thought of Damien's face at the top of those stone steps, cold and distant, refusing to meet her eyes. She thought of the silver bond that had once connected them, now cut and bleeding somewhere deep inside her chest. She thought of Claire Whitfield's satisfied smile. And then she took a breath, and she walked forward, past the last boundary marker, into the trees. The forest swallowed the moonlight almost immediately. The trees here grew taller and closer together than the ones near the packlands, their branches weaving into a thick canopy that let through only thin threads of silver light. The air smelled different too, older somehow, heavy with moss and damp earth, and something else Elena could not name, something that made the hair on her arms rise even though the night was not particularly cold. She walked for what felt like hours, following no path because there was no path to follow. Every so often she heard sounds in the distance, the snap of a branch, the low call of some animal she did not recognize, and each time her heart jumped into her throat before settling again. She reminded herself, over and over, that she had chosen this. That anything, even the unknown dangers of a forbidden forest, was better than staying behind to watch Damien marry someone else. As the night deepened, exhaustion began to catch up with her. Her feet ached inside her boots, and the small bag on her shoulder felt heavier with every step. She found a small clearing beneath an old oak tree, its roots rising from the ground like the ribs of some enormous sleeping creature, and decided it was as good a place as any to rest until dawn. She sat with her back against the trunk, pulled her knees to her chest, and finally allowed herself to feel everything she had been holding back since she walked out of that hall. The tears came quietly at first, then harder, until her shoulders shook with the force of them. She cried for the years she had spent hoping. She cried for the humiliation of being rejected in front of an entire hall of strangers. She cried, most of all, for the strange, aching hollowness where the bond used to be, a space in her chest that felt like a held breath that would never be released. She did not know how long she cried, but eventually the tears slowed, and a strange kind of calm settled over her. The calm that comes after a storm has finally passed. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked up at the small patches of night sky visible through the canopy above. I am not going back, she whispered to the trees, to the darkness, to whatever might be listening. Whatever is out here, I will face it before I go back to being someone he can throw away. As if in answer, somewhere far off in the darkness, something howled, a long, low, mournful sound that was answered a moment later by another voice, and then another, until the forest seemed to hum with distant calls that did not belong to any pack Elena had ever known. She should have been afraid. Some small, sensible part of her mind told her she should get up immediately, climb the nearest tree, or run back toward the boundary while she still could. But instead, strangely, she felt something like recognition, as though the forest itself were acknowledging that she had arrived, that she was now a part of whatever strange world existed beyond the boundary markers. Meanwhile, back within the walls of the Cross pack house, Damien Cross stood alone on the balcony outside his private chamber, staring out at the same dark tree line that Elena had just entered. The celebration inside the hall had continued without him for a while, Claire Whitfield accepting congratulations with practiced grace. But Damien had slipped away as soon as he could, claiming exhaustion, and no one had questioned an Alpha King's need for solitude. He gripped the stone railing until his knuckles went pale. He told himself, as he had told himself all evening, that he had done what was necessary. The alliance with the Eastern Pack was critical. Enemy packs had been testing the northern borders for months, and Claire Whitfield's family controlled resources and warriors that his territory desperately needed. A political marriage was not a matter of the heart. It was a matter of survival for thousands of wolves under his protection. And yet something inside his chest felt wrong, had felt wrong, from the moment he spoke those cold, rehearsed words to Elena in front of the entire hall. He had expected relief once the announcement was made, once the difficult moment had passed. Instead, he felt as though something vital had been torn loose inside him, leaving a raw, aching wound where his confidence usually lived. He told himself it would fade. Rejections were not uncommon among wolves who chose duty over instinct. The ache would pass in a few days, he assured himself, and he would settle into his new arrangement with Claire, and life would continue as it always had. But as the night wore on, the ache did not fade. It grew sharper, more insistent, until it felt less like sorrow and more like a physical wound, throbbing somewhere beneath his ribs, in perfect rhythm with his heartbeat. He had heard stories of alphas who rejected their mates and later regretted it, stories of the bond turning inward like a blade when it was denied instead of severed cleanly. But he had always assumed those stories were exaggerated, the kind of thing elders told young wolves to frighten them into taking the mate bond seriously. Now, standing alone in the cold night air, he was no longer so certain. He closed his eyes and tried to focus on the sensation, the way his instincts told him to, when tracking a scent or sensing danger nearby. And there it was, faint but unmistakable, a thread of connection stretching out from his chest toward the dark forest beyond the packlands, toward the forbidden lands. His eyes snapped open. That was impossible. No one crossed into the forbidden lands voluntarily. It was a place of old magic and older dangers, a place where the boundary between the physical world and something stranger had worn thin generations ago, during a battle so terrible that the survivors had sealed the land off rather than risk fighting there again. Surely Elena would not have gone there. Surely she was safely tucked away somewhere within pack territory, perhaps at the home of her friend Grace Bennett, waiting for her wounded pride to heal before deciding what to do next. But the thread in his chest pulled again, more insistently this time, and Damien felt a cold certainty settle over him that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with instinct, honed over a lifetime of leading wolves through danger. She had gone into the forest. He turned from the balcony and strode back into his chamber, already calling for his personal guard, his mind racing through everything he knew about the forbidden lands, which was frighteningly little. No maps existed of the interior. No reliable accounts had emerged from the handful of travelers who claimed to have entered and returned, and those few accounts contradicted each other so wildly that most wolves dismissed them as fireside exaggeration. What he did know was this: the bond between mates did not simply disappear because one party spoke words of rejection in a crowded hall. It could be suppressed, it could be ignored, but apparently, as he was now discovering, it could also refuse to die quietly, twisting instead into something that pulled at him with an urgency he had never experienced before. He found his personal guard, a steady, broad-shouldered wolf named Owen Blake, waiting in the corridor, drawn by the sound of Damien's raised voice. "Prepare a small party," Damien said. "We ride within the hour." Owen's brow furrowed. "Ride where, my lord? The celebration is still underway. Your absence will be noticed." "Let it be noticed," Damien said. "Elena Hartley has entered the Forbidden Lands, and I intend to bring her back." Owen's expression shifted from confusion to something closer to alarm. "My lord, with respect, the Council will never sanction an expedition into the Forbidden Lands, especially not led by the Alpha King himself. The risk—" "I am not asking the Council," Damien said, already moving down the corridor toward the armory. "I am telling you what is happening. You may join me, or you may stay behind and explain my absence to my uncle. Either way, I am leaving within the hour." Owen studied him for a long moment, and whatever he saw in Damien's face convinced him that no argument would change the king's mind. He nodded once, sharply, and turned to gather what supplies he could without alerting the rest of the packhouse to their departure. Damien stood alone for a moment longer, staring down the dark corridor toward the night beyond the windows. He thought of Elena's face as she had spoken her final words to him in the hall, proud and unbroken despite the cruelty he had shown her. He thought of the years she had waited patiently for a bond he had never properly honored, and he thought, with a growing sense of dread, of everything that might be waiting for her in a forest that had swallowed travelers whole for generations without ever giving them back. Whatever it cost him, whatever the Council said, whatever damage it did to the fragile new alliance with the Eastern Pack, he was not going to let her face that darkness alone. He had rejected her once already. He would not compound that mistake by failing to protect her now. Within the hour, as promised, Damien rode out from the packhouse with Owen Blake and 2 other trusted warriors, leaving behind a hall still humming with celebration, a bride who did not yet know her intended husband had already left, and a council who would wake the next morning to discover their king had vanished into the one place every wolf in the territory had been taught to fear since childhood. Ahead of them, somewhere in the deep darkness of the Forbidden Lands, Elena Hartley slept beneath the old oak tree, unaware that the man who had broken her heart only hours earlier was already following the fading thread of a bond neither of them had asked for, riding straight into the unknown to find her. The forest around her stirred quietly in the moonlight, patient and watching, as if it already knew that both of their lives were about to change in ways neither of them could yet imagine. A twig snapped somewhere close, and Elena's eyes flew open before her mind had even finished waking. Gray light filtered down through the canopy above, the kind of pale, uncertain light that comes just before true morning, and for a moment she could not remember where she was. Then the ache in her chest reminded her, and the memory of the previous night came rushing back all at once. She sat up slowly, every muscle stiff from sleeping against the hard roots of the oak tree, and listened. The forest was quiet now, none of the distant howls that had filled the night, but the silence itself felt watchful, as though 100 eyes were resting on her from somewhere among the trees. She got to her feet, brushed the dirt from her dress, and reached for the small bag Grace had packed for her. Whatever waited ahead, she was not going to face it sitting still. She picked a direction, deeper into the trees, away from the boundary she had crossed the night before, and began to walk. The forest here was unlike anything Elena had seen in the Packlands. The trees grew impossibly tall, their trunks wider than 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder, and strange silver moss clung to the bark in patterns that almost looked deliberate, like veins running beneath skin. Every so often she passed stones arranged in careful circles, half buried in fallen leaves, remnants of something old and purposeful that no living wolf could explain. By mid-morning, hunger had begun to gnaw at her stomach. She stopped beside a small stream to drink and eat a little of the dried food Grace had packed, and it was there, crouched at the water's edge, that she first felt it. A prickling at the back of her neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She rose slowly, scanning the trees around her, her heart beginning to pound. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, from behind a cluster of ferns, a figure stepped into view. It was a girl, younger than Elena, perhaps 16 or 17, with tangled dark hair and clothes stitched together from mismatched scraps of fabric and fur. Her eyes were sharp and cautious, the eyes of someone who had learned long ago not to trust strangers. "You shouldn't be here," the girl said, her voice low. Nobody comes this deep unless they're running from something. Elena straightened, trying to keep her own voice steady despite her racing heart. I am Elena. I mean you no harm. Who are you? The girl studied her for a long moment before answering. Ivy, she said finally. I live here. Most of us do. The ones who couldn't stay where we came from. Most of us? Ivy tilted her head toward the deeper woods. There's a camp. Not far. People who were pushed out of their packs, or ran from them, same as you look like you did. Her sharp eyes flicked over Elena's fine, if now dirty, dress. You've got the look of someone who used to matter to a pack. What happened? Elena hesitated, unsure how much to share with a stranger, but something in Ivy's careful, guarded expression reminded her painfully of herself the night before, standing alone at the boundary marker, with nothing but a small bag and a broken heart. I was rejected, she said simply, by someone I trusted. Something shifted in Ivy's expression, a flicker of understanding that suggested she knew exactly what that kind of pain felt like. Come on then, she said, turning and gesturing for Elena to follow. You won't last a day out here alone, not with what moves through these woods after dark. Elena followed, telling herself she had little choice, and also, if she was honest, feeling a small measure of relief at the idea of not being entirely alone in this strange, ancient place. They walked for perhaps an hour before the trees began to thin into a wide clearing, and Elena saw the camp Ivy had mentioned. It was larger than she expected, a scattering of huts built from branches and woven vines, smoke rising from several small cooking fires, and perhaps 30 or 40 people moving between the structures, going about tasks that looked almost ordinary despite the strange setting. Children ran between the huts. An older woman sat mending a torn shirt. A group of young men sharpened knives near the edge of the clearing. This is Emberwood, Ivy said. It's not much, but it's safe mostly. As safe as anywhere in the Forbidden Lands gets. As they entered the clearing, several heads turned toward them, expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion. A tall man with a scarred face and cold, assessing eyes approached them, his gaze fixed on Elena. Ivy, he said, his voice carrying an edge of authority that made it clear he held some position of power here. Who is this? Her name is Elena, Ivy said. Found her by the stream. She's alone, no pack backing her. The man circled Elena slowly, studying her the way a trader might study livestock, and something about his careful, calculating expression made Elena's skin crawl. Elena, he repeated, and what pack did you belong to, before you decided to wander into a forest that eats travelers whole? Elena lifted her chin, refusing to let her fear show. That doesn't matter anymore. I have no pack now. The man's mouth curled into something that was not quite a smile. Everyone here has no pack now. That's rather the point of Emberwood, isn't it? My name is Victor Lang. I keep order here, such as it is. You'll find that Emberwood can be a good home to those willing to contribute. We ask for honesty, and we ask for loyalty. In return, you'll have shelter, food, and protection from what wanders these woods after dark. There was something in the way he said protection that made Elena's instincts prickle with warning, but she had little choice, exhausted and alone as she was, and so she nodded carefully. I can work, she said. I'm not afraid of effort. Victor's eyes lingered on her a moment longer than felt comfortable before he finally nodded and turned away, calling for someone to show her where she could sleep. Ivy touched her arm gently as Victor walked off. Be careful around him, Ivy murmured, so quietly only Elena could hear. He likes to know everyone's secrets, especially the secrets of people who might be worth something to someone back beyond the boundary. Elena filed the warning away carefully, thanking Ivy for her honesty, and spent the rest of the day learning the rhythms of the small hidden settlement. She met an older woman named Margaret, who taught her how to properly identify which plants in the surrounding forest were safe to eat and which were dangerous. She helped mend torn clothing, alongside two sisters who had fled a pack in the far south after their alpha decided their family had grown too poor to be worth protecting. She listened to stories, quiet and careful ones, shared around the evening fire, stories of packs that discarded members who no longer served a purpose, of wolves cast out for reasons as small as inconvenient birth order or as large as failed political marriages. By the time night fell over Emberwood, Elena found herself feeling something she had not expected to feel so soon after the devastation of the previous evening. A small, cautious sense of belonging. These were people who understood rejection, who had built something out of the wreckage of packs that no longer wanted them. And for the first time since Damien's cold words had shattered her world, Elena allowed herself to imagine a future that did not revolve around waiting for someone else to choose her. But even as that fragile hope began to take root, she noticed Victor watching her from across the fire, his expression unreadable, calculating something behind his cold eyes, and the warning Ivy had given her echoed uneasily in the back of her mind. Meanwhile, deep in the forest behind her, unseen and unheard, Damien Cross and his small party pressed onward, through terrain that seemed determined to slow them at every turn. The horses had grown skittish within the first hour of crossing the boundary, spooked by sounds and shadows that seemed to shift just beyond the edge of vision. And by midday, Damien had made the difficult decision to send the animals back with one of his warriors, rather than risk them bolting deeper into danger. "This land does not want us here," Owen Blake said quietly, as they picked their way over a fallen log slick with strange silver moss. "I can feel it watching us." "Then it will have to get used to us," Damien replied, his voice tight with a determination that had not wavered since they crossed the boundary. "We are not leaving without her." They found traces of Elena's passage as the day wore on. A broken branch here, a footprint pressed into soft earth there, small signs that confirmed she had indeed come this way, however faint and scattered they were. Damien found himself grateful for the tracking skills honed over years of leading hunting parties through his own territory, though he had never imagined using them to search for the very woman he had cast aside only hours before. The thread of connection in his chest pulled steadily onward, guiding him even when the physical trail grew faint, and he clung to that sensation like a lifeline, refusing to let doubt creep into his mind about whether he was truly following her path or simply chasing a feeling born of guilt and regret. As evening approached, Owen called a halt near a small clearing, insisting that continuing after dark in unfamiliar, dangerous terrain was reckless, even for a determined king. Damien argued briefly, the pull in his chest urging him to keep moving, but even he recognized the wisdom in Owen's caution. They made a small camp, ate a quiet meal, and set watches through the night. Sitting alone during his turn at watch, staring into the darkness beyond their small fire, Damien found his thoughts circling back, again and again, to the moment he had spoken those cruel words to Elena in the hall. He had told himself it was necessary, that duty demanded it, but sitting here now, in a forest that felt alive and watchful around him, he found it harder and harder to believe his own justifications. He thought of the years before that terrible night, small moments he had barely allowed himself to notice at the time. The way Elena had once tended his wounded hand after a training accident, her touch gentle and careful, despite his gruff insistence that he did not need help. The quiet, steady way she had always supported pack initiatives that benefited the weakest members of their community, even when doing so gained her little personal advantage. He had noticed these things, in the back of his mind, even as he told himself that duty and politics mattered more than whatever quiet affection had been growing between them. He had been a fool. And now, somewhere ahead of him, in a forest that had swallowed countless travelers without a trace, the woman he had wronged was facing dangers he could not yet see or understand, and all he could do was follow a fading thread of connection and hope, desperately, that he would reach her before something in these forbidden woods reached her first. The night stretched on, long and watchful, and somewhere far beyond the small circle of firelight, unseen eyes tracked the small party's progress with patient, calculating interest, waiting to see what the Alpha King would do next, now that he had entered a land that answered to older laws than any crown could claim. The scream tore through Emberwood just after midnight, sharp and terrified, and Elena was on her feet before she even understood why. Around her, the small hut she shared with Ivy and two other women erupted into motion, everyone grabbing whatever weapon lay closest at hand. "What's happening?" Elena asked, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Rogues," Ivy said grimly, already moving toward the door with a long knife in her hand. "Sometimes packs from the border send scouts in, looking for anyone who might be worth capturing. Stay close to me." Outside, the camp had become chaos. Firelight threw wild shadows across the clearing as figures moved between the huts, some clearly belonging to Emberwood, others strangers, dressed in dark leather, with the look of trained fighters, rather than desperate wanderers. Victor Lang stood near the center of the clearing, directing his people with sharp, barked commands, and despite her wariness of him, Elena found herself grateful for his obvious competence in the moment. "They're after the healer's stores," someone shouted, "and anyone young enough to sell to the border markets." The words sent a cold jolt of fear through Elena. She had heard whispers, during her short time in Emberwood, of certain packs near the eastern border, who dealt in wolves stolen from vulnerable, unclaimed settlements like this one, selling them into forced servitude in territories far from anyone who might come looking for them. A rogue fighter appeared suddenly from between two huts, moving directly toward Elena and Ivy with obvious intent. Ivy stepped in front of Elena, knife raised, but the rogue was larger and clearly more experienced, closing the distance before Ivy could properly set her stance. Elena did not think. She grabbed a heavy piece of firewood from a nearby pile and swung it with all the strength her fear could summon, catching the rogue across the back of the head just as he raised his weapon toward Ivy. He staggered, cursing, and Ivy took the opening to drive her knife into his shoulder, forcing him back with a pained shout. "Run," Ivy said, grabbing Elena's arm. "This way, toward the trees. We can't win a fight like this out in the open." They fled together into the darkness beyond the clearing, the sounds of struggle fading slightly behind them, though Elena's mind kept replaying the moment she had struck the rogue, the strange surge of strength she had felt coursing through her body in that instant of pure necessity. It had not felt entirely like her own strength. It had felt like something older, something that had been sleeping quietly inside her, waking suddenly in response to danger. They had not gone far when a hand shot out from behind a tree and seized Ivy's arm, wrenching her backward with a cry of pain. Elena spun to see another rogue, this one wearing markings she did not recognize, dragging Ivy toward him despite her struggles. "Let her go," Elena said, her voice shaking but firm. The rogue laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound. "Two for the price of one tonight. Lucky me." He reached for Elena with his free hand, and in that moment, something inside her chest ignited, a burst of heat and pressure that felt like nothing she had ever experienced before. The world seemed to sharpen around her, colors growing more vivid, sounds becoming almost painfully clear, and when the rogue's hand closed around her wrist, she felt a surge of raw power flow through her, unbidden and uncontrolled. The rogue cried out and released her instantly, stumbling backward as though he had touched something burning hot. He stared at her, his expression shifting from confidence to something closer to fear. "What are you?" he breathed. Elena did not know the answer herself, but she did not waste the moment of confusion. She grabbed Ivy's free hand and pulled her away from the stunned rogue, and together, they ran deeper into the trees, not stopping until the sounds of the fight had faded entirely into the distance, and the forest around them had returned to its usual watchful silence. They collapsed against a fallen log, both breathing hard, and Ivy stared at Elena with wide, astonished eyes. "What did you do back there?" He looked like he'd been burned. "I don't know," Elena admitted, her hands still trembling. "Something happened. I felt this strange heat, and then he just let go." Ivy studied her for a long moment, something calculating entering her expression despite the fear still evident on her face. "There are old stories," she said slowly, "about bloodlines that carry a different kind of power. Not the ordinary wolf strength everyone has, but something deeper, something tied to the old magic that still lingers in these woods. I always thought they were just stories, told to explain why the forbidden lands are the way they are." "What kind of power?" Elena asked. "I don't know exactly," Ivy said. "Nobody living does, not really. But my grandmother used to say that certain families, generations back, carried the blood of the first wolves who lived in harmony with the magic here, before the great battle that sealed this land away. She said their descendants sometimes still carried traces of that old power, sleeping quietly until something woke it." Elena looked down at her own hands, still faintly tingling with residual heat, and felt a strange mixture of fear and fascination. She had always known herself as ordinary, an omega with no particular strength or status within her old pack, valued mainly for her patience and her willingness to support others. The idea that something extraordinary might be sleeping inside her, waiting all these years for the right moment to wake, was almost too strange to fully process. They made their way back toward Emberwood cautiously, uncertain what they would find, and were relieved to discover that the rogue attack had ultimately been repelled, though not without cost. 2 of the settlement's people had been badly wounded, and Victor Lang stood near the central fire, his expression grim as he assessed the damage. When he caught sight of Elena and Ivy returning, his eyes narrowed with obvious curiosity, and Elena had the uncomfortable feeling that word of what had happened in the forest had already reached him somehow. "I heard," he said, approaching them slowly, "that our newest arrival has a rather unusual gift." Ivy stiffened beside her, clearly regretting having spoken so openly, but the damage was already done. Elena forced herself to meet Victor's calculating gaze steadily. "I don't know what happened," she said carefully. "It was instinct, nothing more. Fear can make people do strange things." Victor studied her for a long moment, and Elena had the distinct sense that he did not believe her. Not entirely, but he let the matter drop for the moment, turning instead to organize the settlement's recovery efforts. Still, throughout the following days, Elena noticed him watching her more closely than before, his interest sharpening in a way that made her deeply uneasy. Meanwhile, several miles away, Damien and his party had encountered their own difficulties. The terrain had grown steadily more treacherous as they pressed deeper into the forbidden lands, the ground occasionally shifting beneath their feet in ways that defied ordinary explanation. Paths that seemed to lead in one direction, somehow curving back on themselves when least expected. "This land plays tricks on travelers," Owen muttered, studying a cluster of stones that looked disturbingly similar to ones they had passed hours earlier. "I fear we may be walking in circles." Damien felt the same frustration gnawing at him, but the pull of the bond in his chest remained steady, a constant point of reference even when the physical landscape seemed determined to confuse them. He followed that internal compass with grim determination, ignoring his growing exhaustion and the way his warriors exchanged increasingly worried glances behind his back. On the 3rd day since crossing the boundary, they encountered the first solid evidence that they were closing the distance. A trampled clearing, still smelling faintly of smoke, scattered with signs of a recent struggle. Damien crouched to examine broken branches and disturbed earth, his heart tightening with fear at what the evidence suggested. "There was a fight here," he said quietly. "Recently." Owen knelt beside him, examining a scrap of fabric caught on a low branch. "This isn't pack cloth. Someone else lives out here." Damien felt the thread in his chest pull insistently toward the northwest, and though every instinct told him to charge forward immediately, years of leadership had taught him the value of caution in unfamiliar, dangerous territory. He forced himself to move carefully, scanning their surroundings for any sign of danger, but the urgency clawing at his chest made every slow, deliberate step feel unbearable. "She's close," he said, more to himself than to his companions. "I can feel it." As the light began to fade on the 3rd evening, they crested a small rise and finally saw it in the distance. Thin threads of smoke, rising above the tree line, marking the location of what could only be a settlement of some kind, exactly in the direction the bond continued to pull him. "That's where she is," Damien said, his voice tight, with a mixture of relief and renewed fear. Whatever settlement existed in the depths of the forbidden lands, he had no way of knowing whether it represented safety for Elena or an entirely new danger, and the uncertainty gnawed at him as fiercely as any physical wound. "We should approach carefully," Owen advised. "We don't know who lives there, or how they'll react to strangers, especially strangers wearing the marks of the Northern Pack." Damien nodded reluctantly, forcing himself to accept the wisdom of caution, even as every instinct urged him to run straight toward that distant smoke. They made camp for the night, just out of sight of the settlement, planning to approach properly with the light of morning, and Damien spent much of the night staring toward the faint glow on the horizon, wondering what Elena's life had become in the days since she fled the Packlands, and whether she would even want to see him after everything he had done. The bond in his chest pulsed steadily, a quiet, insistent reminder that whatever else had changed between them, the connection itself remained, stubborn and unbroken despite his own foolish attempt to sever it. He did not know yet whether that connection was a gift or a curse, whether it would lead him toward reconciliation or toward watching Elena walk away from him a second time, this time by her own choice rather than his cruelty. But he knew, with a certainty that had grown stronger with every mile of this difficult journey, that he could not simply return to his old life without first making things right, whatever the cost to his pride or his political ambitions. The alliance with the Eastern Pact suddenly felt distant and unimportant compared to the simple, overwhelming need to see Elena safe, to explain himself, to beg, if necessary, for a chance to undo the damage his own cowardice had caused. Dawn could not come quickly enough. Morning light had barely touched the treetops when Elena woke to the sound of raised voices near the edge of Emberwood. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to find a small crowd gathered near the northern boundary of the clearing, tension crackling through the air. "Strangers," Ivy said, appearing at her side, her expression tight with concern. 4 of them. Victor's people spotted them approaching at first light. Elena's stomach twisted with worry. After the rogue attack only days earlier, the entire settlement was on edge, and any unfamiliar presence near their hidden home was treated as an immediate threat. She followed Ivy toward the gathering crowd, straining to see past the shoulders of the people in front of her. Victor stood at the front of the group, along with several of his most trusted fighters, all positioned defensively, as 4 figures emerged from the tree line. Elena's breath caught in her throat the moment she recognized the man leading the small group. Damien. He looked different than she remembered, exhausted and travel-worn, his fine clothes replaced by simple, practical garments, suited to days of hard walking through unforgiving terrain. His eyes swept across the gathered crowd with obvious urgency, searching, and when they finally landed on her, Elena watched something in his expression crumble with visible relief. "Elena," he said, taking a step forward, and the sound of her name in his voice, so different from the cold, flat tone he had used in the hall days earlier, sent a confusing rush of emotions through her chest. Victor moved immediately to block his path, one hand resting meaningfully on the knife at his belt. "That's close enough, stranger. State your business, or turn around and leave the way you came." Damien's gaze remained fixed on Elena, even as he addressed Victor. "My business is with her. I mean no harm to your settlement." "Everyone who comes here claims to mean no harm," Victor said coolly. "Yet Emberwood was attacked only days ago by rogues, looking for exactly the kind of people who live here. Forgive me if I don't take a stranger's word without proof." Elena stepped forward before the tension could escalate further, her heart pounding with a chaotic mixture of anger, confusion, and something uncomfortably close to relief at seeing him standing there, safe, in front of her. "Victor, I know him," she said quietly. "This is Damien Cross, Alpha King of the Northern Pack." A ripple of shock passed through the crowd at the announcement. Victor's eyes narrowed further, his posture shifting into something even more guarded. The Alpha King himself, wandering into the Forbidden Lands. "Now that is interesting. Tell me, Your Majesty, what business could possibly bring a king so far from his throne?" Damien's jaw tightened, but his eyes remained fixed on Elena. "I came for her." Elena felt her chest tighten painfully. Part of her wanted nothing more than to run to him, to demand an explanation, to finally understand why he had spoken those cruel words in front of the entire hall. But another part of her, the part still raw from the humiliation of his rejection, held her rooted firmly in place, arms crossed protectively over her chest. "You have some nerve," she said, her voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. "Following me here, after what you did." "I know," Damien said quietly. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you. But please, Elena, give me a chance to explain." Victor watched the exchange with sharp, calculating interest, clearly recalculating something behind his cold eyes. After a long moment, he lowered his hand from his knife, though his guarded posture did not fully relax. "This is not a conversation for the middle of my settlement," he said. "If the king wishes to speak with Elena, he may do so, but under supervision, and his companions will remain here where we can watch them." Damien nodded stiffly, clearly recognizing that arguing would accomplish nothing, and Victor gestured toward a small hut at the edge of the clearing, indicating that Elena and Damien could speak there, while Owen and the other warriors remained under the watchful eyes of Victor's fighters. Inside the small, quiet hut, away from the eyes of the gathered crowd, Elena finally allowed some of her carefully controlled composure to crack. "Why are you here?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "You made everything perfectly clear that night. You rejected me. Publicly. Cruelly. Why would you follow me into a place that has killed more travelers than anyone can count?" Damien's expression was raw, with something that looked almost like pain. "Because the moment I spoke those words, I felt something break inside me that I did not expect. I told myself it was necessary, that duty demanded the alliance with the Eastern Pack, that a political marriage would protect our territory from threats building along our borders. I convinced myself that the bond between us was something I could simply set aside for the greater good. And now?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now I understand that I was wrong," Damien said. "The bond does not simply disappear because someone speaks cruel words in a crowded hall. I have felt it pulling at me every moment since that night, growing sharper rather than fading, until I could not ignore it any longer. I left everything behind, Elena, my throne, my responsibilities, the alliance I sacrificed your feelings to protect. None of it mattered once I understood what I stood to lose." Elena studied his face carefully, searching for any hint of manipulation or calculation, but found only exhaustion and what appeared to be genuine remorse. Still, the wound from that night in the hall remained raw and unhealed, and she was not ready to simply forgive him because he had followed a magical pull into a dangerous forest. "Words are easy," she said finally. "You spoke words that night too, cruel ones, in front of everyone who mattered to me. Why should I believe these words are any different?" Damien's shoulders sagged slightly, as though he had expected exactly this response and had no easy answer for it. "I don't expect you to forgive me simply because I say I'm sorry," he said. "I only ask that you allow me to prove it, through actions rather than words. I am here, in a place that terrifies even the bravest warriors in my territory, because I could not bear the thought of you facing danger alone after what I did to you. That has to count for something, even if it's not enough to erase the pain I caused." Elena was quiet for a long moment, turning his words over carefully in her mind. Part of her wanted desperately to believe him, to let herself hope again, the way she had hoped for 3 long years before that terrible night in the hall. But another part of her, the part that had grown stronger and more independent during her short time in Emberwood, warned her against surrendering too easily to old feelings that had already caused her so much pain. "I need time," she said finally. "You cannot simply walk into this settlement after days of following some magical pull and expect everything to return to how it was before. Too much has changed. I have changed." Damien nodded slowly, accepting her words with visible difficulty but clear respect. "Then I will give you whatever time you need," he said. "I am not asking you to forgive me today. I am only asking that you allow me to stay nearby, to prove through my actions that I mean what I say, for as long as it takes for you to believe me, if that day ever comes." Before Elena could respond, the sound of raised voices erupted outside the hut, followed by the unmistakable clash of weapons. Both of them rushed toward the entrance, hearts pounding with sudden alarm, to find the peaceful morning shattered by chaos. A second group of rogues, larger and better organized than the ones who had attacked days earlier, had emerged from the tree line on the opposite side of the settlement, catching Emberwood's defenders off guard, while their attention had been focused on the unexpected arrival of the Alpha King and his party. "They must have followed your trail," Victor snarled at Damien, already moving to organize his fighters. "A king traveling through these lands leaves signs even the most careless tracker could follow." Damien's expression hardened with guilt and determination in equal measure. "Then I will help you drive them back," he said. "Whatever trouble I have brought to your settlement, I will not stand by and watch it suffer for my mistake." He drew the sword at his hip and moved immediately toward the fighting, Owen and his warriors falling into formation beside him without hesitation. Elena watched him go, her heart caught in a painful tangle of emotions she did not have time to properly untangle before the sounds of battle demanded her full attention. Around her, Emberwood's people scrambled to defend their home, and Elena felt that same strange heat beginning to build in her chest once more, the same mysterious power that had saved her and Ivy days earlier, now rising in response to the danger threatening the fragile community that had taken her in. Whatever answers waited for her regarding Damien's sudden appearance and the strange power stirring inside her own blood, they would have to wait. For now, Emberwood needed every hand it could find, and Elena was determined not to stand aside while people who had shown her unexpected kindness fought for their lives. She grabbed a knife from a nearby weapons rack and ran toward the sound of battle, her heart pounding with fear and something else, something that felt almost like purpose. Steel rang against steel as Elena burst into the chaos of the clearing, her borrowed knife feeling small and inadequate against the sight of so many armed rogues pressing through the settlement's thin defenses. Smoke from a burning hut stung her eyes, and the air was filled with shouts, the clash of weapons, and the frightened cries of children being hurried toward whatever shelter their families could find. She spotted Ivy near the center of the fighting, back pressed against a wooden post as two rogues closed in on her. Without thinking, Elena ran toward them, and as she moved, the strange heat building in her chest surged upward, flooding through her arms and hands until her skin seemed to hum with contained energy. "Ivy," she shouted, and the nearest rogue turned at the sound of her voice, giving Ivy just enough time to duck away from his strike. Elena did not slow down. She threw herself at the rogue, and when her hand connected with his arm, the same burning surge of power that had saved her days earlier erupted outward, and the man cried out in pain, stumbling backward as though he had touched a burning coal rather than a young woman's hand. Elena stared at her own palm in astonishment, even as she pressed the advantage, shoving the disoriented rogue hard enough that he fell and did not immediately rise again. "How are you doing that?" Ivy gasped, scrambling to her feet. "I don't know," Elena admitted, breathless. "But right now, I don't care. Let's help the others." Across the clearing, Damien fought with the practiced precision of a warrior trained since childhood, his sword moving in efficient, deadly arcs as he pushed back against the rogues threatening Emberwood's fighters. Owen fought at his side, the two of them forming a wall of steel that the attackers struggled to breach, but even their combined skill could not hold back the sheer number of enemies pressing in from multiple directions. Victor Lang moved through the battle with cold efficiency, directing his people with sharp commands even as he fought his own share of attackers, and despite her lingering distrust of him, Elena found herself grateful for his obvious leadership in the chaos. "They're targeting the healer's hut," Victor shouted, cutting down an approaching rogue with brutal efficiency. "Protect the supplies, or we'll all suffer for it later." Elena and Ivy fought their way toward the small structure where Emberwood's meager medical supplies were kept, and it was there that Elena came face to face with the rogue leader, a broad-shouldered man with cold eyes and a long scar across his cheek, clearly directing the attack from close range. "Well now," he said, studying her with sudden, sharp interest. "You're the one they told us about, the girl with the strange fire in her blood." Elena's stomach dropped. The rogue who had escaped their encounter days earlier had clearly reported what he witnessed, and this attack was not simply opportunistic raiding, it was targeted, aimed specifically at capturing her. "Stay away from her," Ivy snarled, stepping protectively in front of Elena, but the rogue leader simply laughed, gesturing for two of his fighters to move around Ivy's flank. Elena felt panic threatening to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to breathe, to focus, remembering the strange, calm certainty that had guided her power in the previous encounters. She closed her eyes for the briefest moment, reaching inward toward that burning sensation in her chest, and when she opened them again, she felt steadier, more in control. "I said stay away," she repeated, and this time her voice carried an unexpected strength that made even the confident rogue leader hesitate slightly. He lunged anyway, clearly unwilling to let a moment of uncertainty cost him his prize, but Elena was ready. She stepped into his attack rather than away from it, catching his wrist as his blade came down, and the surge of power that erupted from the contact was stronger than anything she had summoned before, throwing the man backward with enough force that he crashed into a nearby hut, momentarily stunned. For a moment, the fighting around them seemed to pause, both rogues and Emberwood's defenders staring at the sight of the rogue leader sprawled against the shattered wall of a hut, clearly thrown by something far stronger than an ordinary strike should have produced. "Damien," cutting his way through the battle toward Elena's position, caught sight of what had happened, and felt something between awe and fear settle over him. He had heard old stories, the same fading legends that most wolves dismissed as fireside tales, about bloodlines carrying traces of ancient magic, tied specifically to the Forbidden Lands. He had never expected to witness such power firsthand, and certainly never from the woman he had once dismissed as simply a quiet, unremarkable Omega. "Elena," he called, fighting his way closer, determined to reach her side before the stunned rogue leader recovered. The rogue leader shook off his daze quickly, fury replacing his earlier confidence, and shouted a command to his remaining fighters. "Take her regardless of the cost. The buyers will pay double for someone with power like that." The battle intensified around Elena as rogues pressed forward with renewed determination, and though her strange power gave her an advantage, she was quickly growing exhausted, the unfamiliar strain of channeling whatever ancient force lived within her, taking a visible toll. Damien finally reached her side, positioning himself protectively as more attackers converged. "Stay close to me," he said, and despite everything, despite the pain and confusion of the past days, Elena found herself grateful for his presence, for the solid, practiced strength he brought to the fight beside her. Together, they fought back against the encroaching rogues, Damien's trained swordsmanship complementing Elena's unpredictable bursts of power in a way that gradually began to turn the tide of the battle. Victor and his fighters rallied around them, and slowly, painfully, Emberwood's defenders began pushing the attackers back toward the tree line. The rogue leader, seeing his forces faltering and his prize slipping away, made one final, desperate attempt to reach Elena directly, breaking through the defensive line with reckless speed. Damien saw the danger a fraction of a second too late, and the rogue leader's blade caught him across the forearm as he moved to intercept, a deep, painful gash that sent blood spilling down his arm. "Damien!" Elena cried out, and something in her broke loose entirely at the sight of him wounded, protecting her despite everything that had passed between them. The power inside her surged with an intensity she had not yet experienced, and without fully understanding what she was doing, she thrust both hands toward the rogue leader, and a wave of scorching heat erupted outward, throwing him backward with such force that he did not rise again. Silence fell over the clearing as the remaining rogues, witnessing their leader's defeat, began a hasty, disorganized retreat into the surrounding forest. Emberwood's defenders did not pursue, too exhausted and relieved to press their advantage further, and slowly, the sounds of battle faded into the quieter sounds of a settlement beginning to assess its wounds and losses. Elena rushed to Damien's side, her hands trembling as she examined the wound on his arm, the strange power that had burned so fiercely only moments before, now retreating back into whatever quiet place it usually rested. "You shouldn't have moved in front of me," she said, her voice thick with worry despite everything. "I would do it again," Damien said quietly, wincing as she pressed a torn strip of fabric against the wound to slow the bleeding. "I told you I came here to protect you, Elena. I meant it." Around them, Emberwood's people began the difficult work of caring for their wounded and assessing the damage to their homes, and Victor approached slowly, his expression, for the first time since Elena had met him, holding something that looked almost like respect. "That was quite a display," he said, looking between Elena and Damien with renewed calculation. "Both of you fought well for this settlement, whatever complicated history exists between you." He paused, studying Elena more closely. "That power you showed. I have heard old stories about bloodlines tied to this forest's ancient magic. It seems those stories may hold more truth than most of us believed." Elena said nothing, still shaken by the intensity of what she had unleashed, and uncertain what it truly meant for her future. Damien watched her carefully, concern, and something like wonder mixing in his tired eyes, and for a moment, despite the blood and exhaustion and unresolved pain between them, something in the space that separated them felt just slightly smaller than it had that morning. As evening fell over the battered settlement, Elena helped tend to the wounded alongside Ivy and Margaret, grateful for the exhausting work that kept her mind from dwelling too long on the strange, frightening power stirring inside her, or on the complicated tangle of emotions that Damien's continued presence stirred within her chest. Whatever answers waited ahead, regarding her mysterious bloodline, regarding the fragile, uncertain future between herself and the man who had both broken and followed her heart into the depths of a forbidden forest. They would have to wait until Emberwood had finished counting its losses and tending its wounds. For now, survival was enough. 3 days passed before Emberwood truly began to feel like itself again. The burned hut had been rebuilt, the wounded were healing steadily under Margaret's careful attention, and a wary sense of normal routine had settled back over the small settlement. Damien's wound, though deep, had begun to close cleanly, thanks in part to Elena's insistence on changing the dressing herself every morning, an act that neither of them commented on directly, but that carried a quiet weight between them, each time her hands moved carefully over his injured arm. Elena had not yet given him the forgiveness he clearly hoped for, but something had shifted since the battle. She no longer flinched away from his presence, no longer forced herself to maintain careful distance whenever he was near. They spoke often now, quiet conversations shared while she worked on settlement chores, or while they sat together near the evening fires, and slowly, carefully, Elena found herself learning things about Damien that she had never known during her years of quiet, patient waiting back in pack territory. She learned that he had become Alpha King, far younger than most, thrust into leadership after his father's sudden death when Damien was barely 20, forced to navigate the complicated politics of pack alliances and border threats with little preparation and even less support from a council of older wolves who doubted his ability to lead. She learned that the arrangement with Claire Whitfield had been pressed upon him for over a year by advisors convinced that only a strategic marriage could secure the resources necessary to defend against increasingly aggressive threats along the eastern border. "That still doesn't explain why you never simply spoke to me," Elena said one evening, as they sat together near the edge of the clearing, watching the last light fade behind the trees. "You could have told me, before that night in the hall, that the council was pressuring you toward a political marriage. You could have given me some warning, some chance to prepare myself, instead of humiliating me in front of everyone I knew." Damien was quiet for a long moment, his expression heavy with the particular kind of regret that comes from recognizing one's own cowardice too late to undo it. "You're right," he said finally. "I told myself that a quick, decisive rejection would be kinder than a long, difficult conversation. I was wrong. I chose the option that protected my own comfort, rather than the one that respected yours, and I am deeply sorry for that." Elena studied his face in the dim firelight, searching for any trace of the cold, distant king who had spoken those cruel words days ago, and found instead someone who looked genuinely worn down by regret, someone who had walked away from his throne and into a dangerous, forbidden forest, simply to make things right. "I'm not ready to simply forget what happened," she said quietly, "but I am willing to keep listening, if you're willing to keep being honest with me." It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was something, and Damien accepted it with visible gratitude, understanding that trust, once broken, could not be rebuilt through grand gestures alone, but through countless small moments of honesty, accumulated slowly over time. Their conversations, however, were not the only development occupying Elena's attention during those quiet days of recovery. Ivy had introduced her to Margaret's collection of old, worn journals, passed down through generations of Emberwood's healers, containing scattered references to the ancient magic said to linger throughout the Forbidden Lands. Elena spent hours poring over the faded pages, searching for any information that might explain the strange power that had awakened inside her during moments of danger. "There isn't much," Margaret admitted, watching Elena carefully study yet another page filled with cramped, faded handwriting. "The old stories say that certain bloodlines carried a connection to the land itself, going back to before the great battle that sealed these woods away from the rest of the territory. Some called it fireblood, others called it the old gift. Nobody living has seen it manifest clearly enough to know exactly how it works, or why it appears in some descendants and not others." "Do you know anything about my family line?" Elena asked. "My parents never mentioned anything like this." Margaret shook her head slowly. "That, I cannot tell you. Bloodlines scatter and mix over generations. It's entirely possible your parents never knew what quiet gift ran through your blood, dormant until circumstances demanded it wake." Elena closed the journal carefully, turning the mystery over in her mind. The power frightened her, unpredictable and difficult to control, surging forward only in moments of extreme danger or emotion, but it had also saved her life, and the lives of people she had come to care for during her short time in Emberwood. Whatever this strange inheritance meant for her future, she found herself determined to understand it rather than fear it. That determination led her, several evenings later, to seek out Victor Lang, who she suspected knew more about Emberwood's history and the old magic of the forest than he had yet shared with her directly. She found him alone near the edge of the settlement, sharpening a blade with slow, methodical strokes, and something in his expression when he noticed her approach suggested he had been expecting this conversation eventually. "You want to know more about your power," he said, before she could even ask. "I want to know everything you know," Elena said. "Ivy mentioned old stories. Margaret showed me journals filled with fragments and guesses. I need something more concrete than legends and speculation." Victor set down his blade and studied her carefully, his cold, calculating eyes softening slightly, though not entirely losing their guarded edge. "I have lived in these woods longer than anyone else in Emberwood," he said. "Long enough to have witnessed the old magic manifest more than once, though never quite as strongly as what you displayed during the attack." "Then tell me what you know," Elena pressed. Victor was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh how much to share. "The magic responds to strong emotion," he said finally. "Fear, anger, the desperate need to protect someone you care about. It draws on something ancient, buried deep within the land itself, something that was disturbed during the great battle generations ago and has never fully settled since. Those who carry the old bloodlines can sometimes draw on that lingering power, though it comes at a cost." "What kind of cost?" Elena asked, a chill of apprehension settling over her. "Exhaustion, mostly, in smaller uses," Victor said. "But the stories also speak of those who drew too deeply, too often, and found the power beginning to consume something of themselves in return. The old magic does not simply lend its strength freely, it demands balance, and those who ignore that balance risk losing themselves entirely to whatever ancient force lives beneath these woods." Elena absorbed this information with a growing sense of unease. The power inside her had already saved lives twice, but Victor's warning made clear that relying on it too heavily, too carelessly, carried risks she had not fully considered. "Is there a way to control it?" she asked. "To use it safely, without losing myself?" "Perhaps," Victor said. "Though I do not know the answer myself. There are rumors of a place deeper in the forest, older even than Emberwood, where those who first carried the old bloodlines are said to have learned to master their gift rather than simply be swept along by it. Whether that place still exists, or ever truly existed outside of legend, I cannot say." Elena thanked him for his honesty, though the conversation left her with more questions than answers, and a growing sense that her time in the Forbidden Lands was leading her toward something larger and more consequential than she had ever anticipated when she first fled the Packlands in heartbroken anger. As she made her way back through the darkening settlement, she found Damien waiting near her hut, his expression concerned, as he took in the troubled look on her face. "What's wrong?" he asked. Elena hesitated, then found herself sharing everything Victor had told her. The warnings about balance and cost, the rumors of a place deeper in the forest where the old bloodlines had once been properly understood. Damien listened carefully, his brow furrowed with obvious worry. "If there is truth to what Victor says," he said slowly, "then perhaps finding that place, learning to understand this power properly, matters more right now than anything else. I know I have little right to offer guidance after everything that's happened between us, but I would go with you, Elena, wherever this search leads, if you would allow it." Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing the offer carefully. She was not yet ready to fully trust him again. Not completely, but the sincerity in his voice, the way he had already proven his willingness to face danger on her behalf, made it difficult to simply refuse his help outright. "We'll see," she said finally, which was not quite agreement, but was no longer quite refusal either, and something in Damien's tired, hopeful expression suggested he understood exactly how much that small shift meant, even if neither of them was ready to name it clearly just yet. The decision to leave Emberwood in search of the place Victor had described came sooner than Elena expected, forced by circumstances rather than careful planning. Word reached the settlement only a week after the battle that the surviving rogues had returned to their home territory, with reports of a girl carrying strange, powerful magic, and that certain buyers along the eastern border were now offering a substantial reward for anyone who could capture her alive. "They will keep coming," Victor said grimly, gathering Elena, Damien, Ivy, and Owen together, near the central fire, to discuss the growing threat. "Emberwood cannot withstand repeated attacks of the kind we barely survived last week. If you remain here, you put everyone in this settlement at continued risk." Elena felt the weight of that truth settle heavily over her shoulders. She had come to care deeply for the people of Emberwood during her short time among them, and the idea that her presence now endangered their fragile safety was almost unbearable to consider. "Then I'll leave," she said immediately. "I won't let Emberwood suffer because of what I am." "Where would you go?" Ivy asked, worry evident in her voice. Elena looked toward Victor, who met her gaze steadily. "Deeper into the forest," she said. "To find the place you mentioned, where the old bloodlines were once properly understood. If I can learn to control this power, truly control it, then perhaps I can also learn to defend myself and anyone traveling with me, without needing to hide in a settlement that others might target because of me." Damien stepped forward immediately. "I told you I would go wherever this search led. That offer still stands." Owen, standing beside him, nodded firmly despite the obvious weariness that days of hard travel had etched into his features. "As does mine, my lord. Wherever you go, I go as well." Ivy hesitated only a moment before speaking up herself. "I'm coming too. You saved my life during that first attack, Elena. I'm not letting you walk into deeper danger alone." Victor studied the small group forming before him, something unreadable moving behind his cold, calculating eyes. "I cannot spare many fighters to accompany you," he said finally, "but I will not stop you from making this choice, and I will share what little I know of the path deeper into these woods, toward the old ruins where the story places the ancient center of the bloodline magic." 2 days later, the small group set out from Emberwood at dawn, carrying what supplies the settlement could spare, and following directions that Victor had sketched carefully onto a worn scrap of leather, based on stories passed down through generations of Emberwood's inhabitants, but never confirmed by any living traveler. The journey proved harder than any of them anticipated. The deeper reaches of the forbidden lands grew stranger with every mile, the trees twisting into shapes that seemed almost deliberate, the ground occasionally shifting in ways that defied ordinary explanation. Twice they encountered creatures none of them could properly identify, shadowy shapes that moved just beyond the edge of clear sight and vanished the moment anyone turned to look directly at them. "This place grows stranger the deeper we go," Owen observed on the third day, eyeing a cluster of stones arranged in careful spiral patterns that none of them could explain. "I begin to understand why so few travelers ever return from these woods." Elena found herself growing more attuned to the strange energy of the forest with each passing day, a faint hum of awareness that seemed to grow stronger the closer they came to whatever destination Victor's directions were leading them toward. The power inside her chest felt more present now too, no longer entirely dormant even in moments of calm, as though proximity to the source of the ancient magic was gradually waking something that had slept quietly within her for her entire life. Damien walked beside her often during those difficult days of travel, and slowly, carefully, the careful distance that had defined their conversations back in Emberwood began to soften into something gentler. He told her stories of his childhood, of a father who had been a fair but distant leader, of the crushing responsibility that had fallen onto his shoulders far too young. Elena, in turn, found herself sharing memories of her own upbringing, of parents who had loved her deeply, but had never fully understood the quiet ache of waiting years for a bond that seemed determined to remain unfulfilled. "I used to imagine what it would feel like," she admitted one evening, as they sat slightly apart from the others near a small fire, "when you finally acknowledged the bond properly. I pictured it so many different ways, over so many years. None of them looked anything like what actually happened." Damien winced visibly at her words, but did not look away. "I know I cannot undo that night," he said quietly, "but I promise you, Elena, that every day since then has been spent trying to become someone worthy of a second chance, if you're ever willing to offer one." Elena said nothing for a long moment, watching the fire's small flames dance in the darkness. The anger she had carried since that terrible night in the hall had not entirely faded, but it had softened considerably, tempered by days of watching Damien's genuine effort, his willingness to face danger and discomfort without complaint, his patient acceptance of her continued uncertainty. "I think," she said slowly, choosing her words with care, "that I am starting to believe you mean what you say. That doesn't mean everything is forgiven, but it means something." Damien's expression shifted into something that looked almost like hope, carefully restrained, as though he feared expressing too much emotion might somehow damage the fragile progress they had made. "That's more than I deserve," he said quietly, "but I'll take it, and I'll keep working to deserve more." On the 5th day of travel, they finally reached the place Victor's directions had promised, a wide, ancient clearing at the base of a rocky hill, where the remains of stone structures rose from beneath centuries of moss and fallen leaves, arranged in patterns that suggested careful, deliberate purpose rather than natural formation. At the center of the clearing stood a large, weathered stone archway, its surface carved with symbols none of them recognized, pulsing faintly with a soft, silver light that seemed to breathe in slow, steady rhythm. "This is it," Elena breathed, feeling the strange power inside her chest surge in immediate, powerful response to the ancient energy radiating from the ruins around them. Ivy stared at the archway with wide, astonished eyes. "The old stories are real then? I never fully believed it, even after everything we've seen." As they moved closer to explore the ruins, a figure emerged from the shadows near the base of the archway, an elderly woman with silver hair and pale, ancient eyes that seemed to see far more than any ordinary gaze should allow. She studied Elena with sudden, intense focus, and when she spoke, her voice carried a strange, resonant quality that seemed to echo slightly against the ancient stones surrounding them. "You carry the old blood," the woman said, her eyes fixed on Elena with unmistakable recognition. "It has been a long time since anyone with true fire blood walked into this place." "Who are you?" Elena asked, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and cautious hope. "I am called Rosalind," the woman said. "I have watched over these ruins for longer than you would believe possible, waiting for someone like you to finally find their way here." Her ancient eyes softened slightly, taking in the exhaustion evident on all their faces after days of difficult travel. "You have questions, child. I can see them in your eyes. Come. There is much I can teach you, if you are willing to learn, and much danger waiting for you if you choose to walk away without understanding what truly sleeps within your blood." Elena glanced back at Damien, at Ivy, at Owen, all of them watching her with quiet support, waiting to see what she would decide. She thought of everything that had led her to this moment, the humiliation of that night in the hall, the desperate flight into the forbidden lands, the unexpected community she had found in Emberwood, the strange power that had saved lives, but that she still barely understood, the complicated, uncertain journey toward trusting Damien again. She turned back to Rosalind, and though exhaustion weighed heavily on her body, her voice was steady and certain when she finally spoke. "Teach me," she said. "I want to understand what I truly am." Rosalind's weathered face broke into a small, satisfied smile, and she gestured toward the ancient archway behind her. "Then let us begin," she said. "Your journey, child, has only just reached its true beginning." Rosalind led them past the weathered archway into a hidden chamber, carved deep into the rocky hillside, a space that none of them would have discovered without her guidance, concealed behind a curtain of hanging vines and centuries of undisturbed moss. Inside, the walls were lined with more of the same strange carved symbols that marked the archway outside, glowing faintly with the same soft silver light, illuminating the chamber with a gentle, ever-present glow. "This place was built by the first wolves who carried the old blood," Rosalind explained, as the small group settled cautiously into the chamber. "Long before the great battle that sealed these woods away, they lived here, in careful harmony with the ancient magic, learning to draw upon it without losing themselves to its power." "What happened to them?" Elena asked. Rosalind's expression grew distant and sorrowful. "War came, as it so often does. A rival faction, fearful of the old bloodline's power, attacked this place, and in the chaos of battle, the ancient magic that had been carefully balanced for generations was disturbed and driven wild. Many died. The survivors scattered, taking whatever knowledge they could preserve with them, and eventually, the boundary was sealed. More to protect the outside world from the wild magic than to protect this land from outside threats, though most who tell the story today have forgotten that original purpose. Elena absorbed this history with growing understanding. The Forbidden Lands were not simply dangerous by nature, but had been made dangerous by conflict and loss. The wild, untethered magic a direct consequence of ancient violence, rather than some inherent evil in the land itself. "You said you could teach me to control this power," Elena said. "Please, I need to understand how." Rosalind nodded slowly, gesturing for Elena to sit across from her, near the center of the chamber, while Damien, Ivy, and Owen settled quietly nearby, watching with careful attention. "The old gift responds to emotion," Rosalind began, "particularly to fear and the desperate need to protect. This makes it powerful in moments of true danger, but also unpredictable and difficult to summon deliberately. True mastery comes not from suppressing that emotional connection, but from learning to guide it with intention rather than simply being swept along by instinct." Over the following days, Rosalind guided Elena through careful exercises, teaching her to recognize the subtle warning signs that preceded the power's surge, to breathe through moments of fear rather than letting panic seize control entirely, to focus the building heat in her chest toward specific, deliberate purposes rather than letting it explode outward in uncontrolled bursts. The training was exhausting, both physically and emotionally, and more than once, Elena found herself in tears of frustration as the power slipped beyond her control, scorching the ground around her, or leaving her trembling and depleted after failed attempts at careful, measured use. Damien remained nearby throughout much of the training, offering quiet encouragement, and though Rosalind occasionally sent him away to give Elena space to focus, his steady, patient presence became something Elena found herself grateful for, more often than she wanted to admit. "You're improving," Rosalind observed, on the fourth day of training, as Elena successfully summoned a small, controlled flame in her palm, without the accompanying surge of exhaustion that had plagued her earlier attempts. "The old blood is strong in you, stronger than I have witnessed in many generations. With continued practice, you could become something quite remarkable." "What do you mean?" Elena asked, studying the small flame curiously, as it danced gently across her palm without burning her skin. "The stories speak of those in the old bloodline who eventually learned to master the gift so completely that they could shape and direct the wild magic of this forest itself, not merely draw upon a small portion of it in moments of danger," Rosalind said. "Whether you could reach that level of mastery, I cannot say. But the potential exists within you, if you continue to train with patience and discipline." As the days passed, Elena's control over her strange inheritance grew steadily, and alongside that growing mastery, something else grew as well: the fragile, careful trust rebuilding between herself and Damien. He had remained a constant, steady presence throughout her difficult training, never pushing her to forgive him faster than she was ready, but always present, always willing to listen when she needed to voice her frustrations or fears. One evening, as the others slept and Elena sat alone near the edge of the ancient clearing, unable to quiet her racing thoughts enough for rest, Damien found her there, wrapped in a worn blanket, staring up at the strange, star-filled sky visible through a gap in the forest canopy. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked quietly, settling down beside her without waiting for an invitation, though his posture remained careful, respectful of the space between them. "Too much on my mind," Elena admitted. "Rosalind says I'm making good progress, but I keep thinking about what happens after this. Even if I master this power completely, I still don't know what my life looks like beyond these woods. I can't go back to being who I was before, waiting quietly in the Packlands for a bond that never seemed to matter to anyone but me." Damien was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "You're right," he said finally. "You can't go back to that life, and honestly, I don't think you would want to, even if it were possible. But that doesn't mean there isn't a place for you moving forward, wherever that place turns out to be." "What do you mean?" Elena asked, turning to study his face in the dim, silver-tinted moonlight. "I mean," Damien said slowly, "that I have spent every day of this journey watching you become someone stronger and more remarkable than I ever properly appreciated, when you were simply waiting patiently for me to notice you. I was a fool, Elena, for taking so long to understand what I had in front of me. I don't expect you to simply return to my side, because I've finally realized my mistake. But I want you to know that whatever you choose to do with this power, whatever path you decide to walk once your training here is complete, I would be honored if you allowed me to walk that path alongside you, not as your king demanding loyalty, but simply as someone who has come to deeply respect and care for the person you are. Elena felt her breath catch slightly at the sincerity in his voice, the careful, deliberate way he had chosen his words to avoid pressuring her, while still being completely honest about his feelings. The anger she had carried since that terrible night in the hall had faded considerably over the past weeks, replaced gradually by a cautious, growing warmth that she had been reluctant to fully acknowledge, even to herself. "I'm not ready to say everything is forgiven," she said quietly. "But I think, somewhere during this journey, I stopped needing you to earn forgiveness through grand gestures, and started simply appreciating who you've shown yourself to be when it mattered most." Damien reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and gently took her hand in his. The contact sent a familiar warmth through Elena's chest, though this time it felt nothing like the wild, burning surge of her strange power, and everything like the quiet, steady pull of the mate bond that had connected them since long before either of them fully understood what that connection meant. "Thank you," Damien said softly, "for allowing me the chance to become someone deserving of that." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while after that, watching the strange stars above the ancient clearing, and though neither of them spoke of forgiveness or reconciliation directly again that night, something had shifted quietly between them, a fragile but genuine foundation beginning to form from the wreckage of that terrible night weeks earlier, built now on honesty and patience, rather than empty promises and rushed political convenience. Tomorrow, Rosalind had promised, would bring the final and most difficult stage of Elena's training, a test that would determine whether she had truly mastered the old gift, or remained, despite her progress, still vulnerable to its wild, untethered power. But for tonight, beneath the strange stars of the Forbidden Lands, Elena allowed herself simply to feel hopeful, for the first time in longer than she could properly remember. The ground trembled beneath Elena's feet, the moment Rosalind led her back into the ancient chamber the following morning, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to rise from somewhere far beneath the stone floor itself. Damien, Ivy, and Owen followed close behind, sensing immediately that whatever awaited them today carried far greater weight than the careful training exercises of the previous days. "What's happening?" Elena asked, watching as the silver light etched into the chamber walls began to pulse more rapidly, more urgently than she had witnessed before. Rosalind's expression was grave. "The wild magic that has lingered in these woods since the great battle generations ago has never fully settled," she said. "It stirs, sometimes, in response to significant events, and your arrival here, your growing mastery of the old bloodline's power, has disturbed it more than I anticipated. I fear the final test I intended for you today has arrived sooner, and in a far more dangerous form than I had planned." Before anyone could ask what she meant, the chamber's far wall cracked with a deafening sound, and a surge of raw, untethered magic poured through the widening fracture, taking shape gradually into something resembling a massive, shadowy wolf, formed entirely from swirling darkness and flickering silver light, its eyes burning with ancient, furious energy. "That is the wild magic itself," Rosalind said, backing away with obvious alarm. "Given form by centuries of accumulated violence and unresolved conflict, I had hoped it would remain dormant long enough for your training to properly prepare you, but it seems fate has decided otherwise." The shadowy creature let out a roar that shook the entire chamber, and Owen immediately drew his weapon, positioning himself protectively in front of the group, though the fear evident on his face suggested he understood, on some instinctive level, that ordinary steel would offer little protection against something built from ancient, wild magic. "Elena?" Rosalind said urgently. "This creature is drawn to the disturbance your presence has caused in the balance of this place. You are the only one among us who carries the power necessary to properly confront it. I know your training is incomplete, but I believe in what you have already learned. You must trust yourself now more than you ever have before." Elena felt fear threatening to overwhelm her, the same instinctive panic that had made her earlier attempts at controlled power so difficult, but she forced herself to breathe, to remember Rosalind's careful lessons about guiding emotion with intention rather than being consumed by it. Beside her, Damien reached out and took her hand briefly, his eyes steady with unwavering confidence. "You can do this," he said simply. "I believe in you completely." The shadowy wolf lunged toward them, and Elena stepped forward without hesitation, placing herself between the creature and her companions. The familiar heat surged through her chest, but this time, rather than letting it explode outward in uncontrolled panic, she focused it carefully, exactly as Rosalind had taught her, shaping the building energy into a controlled, radiant shield that met the creature's attack with a burst of blinding silver light. The impact sent Elena stumbling backward, but the shield held, and the shadowy wolf recoiled with an unearthly howl, clearly startled by the controlled resistance it had encountered. Elena pressed forward, drawing on everything she had learned during her days of difficult training, channeling the wild energy of her bloodline into deliberate, focused strikes, rather than the chaotic bursts that had characterized her earlier, untrained attempts. "Keep going," Rosalind called encouragingly. "You are doing exactly what is needed. The creature feeds on chaos and fear. Meet it with calm, deliberate purpose, and you will find its power beginning to weaken." Elena fought with growing confidence, each controlled burst of power meeting the creature's attacks with increasing precision, and slowly, gradually, she began to notice the shadowy wolf's form growing less solid, its furious energy dimming slightly with every exchange. Behind her, Damien, Ivy, and Owen fought to protect her flanks whenever smaller tendrils of dark magic broke away from the main creature to attack from unexpected angles, their combined efforts allowing Elena the space and focus she needed to concentrate on the primary confrontation. But the creature was far from defeated, and as the battle wore on, exhaustion began to creep into Elena's limbs, the strain of sustained, controlled power use taking its inevitable toll, despite her improved mastery. She stumbled, her focus wavering for just a moment, and the shadowy wolf seized the opening immediately, lunging forward with renewed fury. Damien moved without hesitation, throwing himself between Elena and the creature's attack, and though he carried no magic of his own to properly defend against such an assault, his willingness to place himself in harm's way bought Elena precisely the moment she needed to recover her focus. "No," Elena cried out, watching in horror as the creature's dark energy struck Damien directly, throwing him hard against the chamber wall. Something inside her broke loose entirely in that instant. Not the wild, uncontrolled panic of her earlier failed attempts, but something deeper and more powerful, a fierce, protective determination that channeled every ounce of fear and love and desperate hope she carried into a single, focused surge of power. She stepped forward, both hands raised, and released everything she had learned, everything she had felt during these past difficult weeks, directly into the heart of the shadowy creature before her. The chamber filled with blinding silver light, as the wild magic finally shattered under the weight of Elena's focused, deliberate power, the shadowy wolf dissolving into countless scattered motes of light that drifted gently upward before fading entirely into the chamber's high, ancient ceiling. Silence fell, heavy and absolute, broken only by the sound of Elena's ragged, exhausted breathing. She rushed immediately to Damien's side, relief flooding through her when she found him conscious, though clearly shaken and bruised from the impact. "Are you all right?" she asked, her hands trembling as she helped him sit up carefully. "I'll survive," he said, managing a weak, grateful smile despite his obvious pain. "You did it, Elena. You truly did it." Rosalind approached slowly, her expression filled with genuine astonishment and quiet pride. "I have never witnessed anyone master the old gift so completely, and certainly not in such a short span of time," she said. "You have done something today that I believed might take years of careful practice to achieve. The wild magic that has haunted these woods since the great battle generations ago has finally been properly settled, thanks to your courage and your growing mastery." "Does that mean the danger is over?" Ivy asked, helping Owen to his feet nearby, both of them bearing minor injuries from the chaotic battle. "For now," Rosalind said carefully. "Though I suspect the true test of everything you have learned here, Elena, still lies ahead of you, beyond these ancient ruins, in whatever life you choose to build moving forward." Elena looked around at her small group of companions, all of them exhausted but alive, all of them having faced genuine danger together and emerged stronger for it. She thought of Emberwood, of the people there who had taken her in with unexpected kindness during her darkest hour. She thought of the strange, powerful inheritance she now carried, no longer a source of fear, but a tool she had learned, through difficult practice, to properly wield. And she thought of Damien, wounded but alive beside her, having proven through repeated, genuine sacrifice that his regret over that terrible night in the hall ran far deeper than empty words. "Thank you," she said to Rosalind, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything you've taught me." Rosalind smiled warmly, the weight of centuries of solitary guardianship visible in her ancient, weathered features. "The gift was already within you, child. I merely helped you find the courage to properly claim it." She glanced toward Damien, still resting carefully against the chamber wall, and her expression softened further. "It seems you found more than mastery over ancient magic during your time here. Perhaps that, too, was always waiting for you to properly claim it." Elena felt warmth rise in her cheeks, but she did not deny the truth in Rosalind's gentle observation. Whatever remained unresolved between herself and Damien, whatever careful work still lay ahead, in fully rebuilding the trust his cruel words had shattered, something important had shifted between them during this dangerous, transformative journey through the depths of the Forbidden Lands. As the small group began the slow process of tending their wounds and gathering their scattered supplies, preparing for whatever came next, Elena allowed herself, cautiously, to imagine a future that looked nothing like the quiet, waiting life she had once accepted as her only possibility. A future built instead on strength she had discovered within herself, on genuine connection, rebuilt through honesty rather than assumed through duty, and on the possibility, however fragile and uncertain, of a partnership between equals, rather than a king and the Omega he had once so carelessly dismissed. Word of what happened at the ancient ruins reached Emberwood before the small group had even finished the long journey back, carried somehow through the strange, watchful energy of the forest itself, and Elena found herself greeted, not with the cautious welcome of strangers, but with genuine celebration, when she finally walked back into the settlement's central clearing. "You settled the wild magic," Victor said, studying her with an expression of open respect that had been entirely absent during their first meeting weeks earlier. "The forest feels different already, calmer. Whatever you did out there, Elena, the effects reach far beyond those old ruins." Elena smiled, still adjusting to the strange sensation of being looked upon with admiration rather than suspicion or calculation. "I couldn't have done it without help," she said, glancing toward Damien, Ivy, and Owen, who stood nearby, still bearing the marks of their difficult journey, but clearly proud of what they had accomplished together. The following days brought a period of healing and celebration for Emberwood, the settlement's people gathering each evening to share stories and food, grateful for both the defeat of the wild magic and the renewed sense of safety that seemed to settle over the entire forest in its aftermath. Elena found herself embraced fully, as part of the community now, no longer simply a stranger who had wandered in seeking refuge, but someone who had proven, through genuine sacrifice, her commitment to the people who had first offered her shelter. Yet even as she settled comfortably into this new sense of belonging, Elena knew that larger questions still remained unanswered. Word would eventually reach the outside pack territories that the Alpha King had vanished into the Forbidden Lands, and whatever political consequences that absence had already created would need to be addressed, one way or another. It was Damien who finally raised the difficult subject, several evenings after their return, as they walked together along the quiet edge of the settlement, beneath a sky finally clear of the strange, watchful tension that had marked the forest during Elena's early weeks there. "I need to return to my territory eventually," he said carefully. "My council will be in chaos by now, and Claire Whitfield deserves an honest explanation, whatever consequences that brings for the alliance with the Eastern Pack." Elena nodded, having expected this conversation for some time. "I understand," she said. "You have responsibilities that don't simply disappear because we found something important out here." "That's true," Damien agreed. "But I don't want to return to that life, if it means leaving behind everything I've come to understand during this journey. I don't want to return to being someone who chooses political convenience over honesty and genuine connection." He paused, studying her carefully in the soft evening light. I don't know exactly what shape my life should take moving forward, Elena, but I know I don't want to face it without you beside me. Not as an obligation forced upon either of us, but as a choice we both genuinely want to make. Elena felt her heart swell with something that had been building steadily throughout their difficult transformative journey, a warmth that had grown alongside her hard-won trust in the man standing before her. "I'm not the same person who walked away from that hall weeks ago," she said slowly. "I've found strength in myself that I never knew existed. I've found a community here that values me for who I am, not simply for a bond that was decided before either of us had any say in the matter." "I know," Damien said quietly, "and I would never ask you to give up any of that. Whatever we build together moving forward, Elena, I want it to be built on equal footing, on genuine partnership, rather than the old, outdated expectations that led to so much pain between us in the first place." Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for any remaining trace of doubt or hesitation, and found only sincere, patient honesty. The anger she had once carried had fully transformed now into something far more complex and hopeful, a cautious but genuine belief that the man before her had truly become someone worthy of the trust he was asking her to extend. "Then let's find out what that looks like together," she said finally, and the smile that broke across Damien's face in response held none of the cold, distant formality she remembered from that terrible night in the hall, replaced instead by open, unguarded warmth that made her own heart lift in response. Their return to pack territory, when it finally came, proved every bit as complicated as both of them had anticipated. The council, initially furious at their king's unexplained absence, gradually softened their stance upon hearing the full account of what had happened in the Forbidden Lands, though the political fallout from the broken arrangement with Claire Whitfield took considerably longer to resolve. Claire herself, upon learning the full truth of Damien's journey, and his genuine, transformed feelings for Elena, accepted the situation with far more grace than anyone expected, admitting privately that she had entered the arrangement for political advantage rather than any genuine emotional investment, and expressing relief at being freed to pursue alliances more suited to her own ambitions. The Eastern Pax alliance, once thought entirely dependent on the marriage arrangement, was eventually renegotiated through careful diplomacy, built instead on mutual trade benefits and shared defense commitments rather than a political marriage that had never truly served anyone's genuine interests in the first place. Perhaps most significantly, Damien used his renewed position and authority to formally recognize the settlement of Emberwood, offering the community protection and support from the Northern Pack in exchange for their continued independence and self-governance. A partnership that transformed the once feared Forbidden Lands into a place of genuine connection between the established Pack territories and the resilient community that had built a home from the wreckage of rejection and exile. Elena, meanwhile, found her own place, gradually taking shape within this new, evolving world. Rather than simply becoming Damien's mate in the traditional subordinate sense that Pack tradition often expected, she established herself as a genuine partner in leadership, her hard-won mastery over the ancient bloodline magic making her an invaluable bridge between the Northern Pack and the mysterious, powerful forces still lingering within the Forbidden Lands. She traveled regularly between the Pack lands and Emberwood, maintaining the friendships and community connections she had built during her weeks of exile, ensuring that the settlement's voice remained respected and heard within the broader political landscape of the territory. On the evening of their formal mate ceremony, held not in the cold, formal hall where Damien had once rejected her in front of an entire crowd, but in the open, welcoming space of Emberwood's central clearing, surrounded by both her Northern Pack allies and the community that had first taken her in during her darkest hour, Elena stood beside Damien and felt, for the first time in her entire life, that she was exactly where she belonged, not through obligation or waiting patiently for someone else's acknowledgement, but through genuine, hard-won choice. "I once told you that I released you from our bond," she said quietly, as they stood together before the gathered crowd, her voice carrying clearly through the peaceful evening air. "I want you to know that what I'm choosing now is different. I'm not accepting a bond I was born into. I'm choosing you, deliberately and completely, because of who you have proven yourself to be." Damien's eyes shone with emotion as he took her hands in his. "And I am choosing you," he said, Not as the Omega who once waited quietly for my attention, but as the remarkable woman who walked into a forbidden forest alone, rather than accept a life that diminished her worth, and who emerged stronger, wiser, and more powerful than I ever properly appreciated before. I nearly lost you forever. As the ceremony concluded and celebrations spread through the clearing, Elena looked out at the gathered faces, Ivy and Margaret and Victor, and the countless other Emberwood residents who had become her chosen family, alongside Owen and the Northern Pack allies who had come to respect her strength and her sacrifice, and felt a profound sense of peace settle over her heart. The Forbidden Lands, once a place of fear and legend, had become instead a place of transformation, where a broken rejection had ultimately given way to genuine partnership, where ancient wounds from generations past had finally been allowed to heal, and where a woman once dismissed as unremarkable had discovered, through courage and hardship, the true depth of the power she had carried within herself all along. Elena Hartley had walked away from a king who could not see her worth. She returned, in the end, not as someone rescued or redeemed by another, but as someone who had found her own strength first, and chosen, freely and completely, to share that strength with a partner who had finally proven himself worthy of standing beside her. And in the quiet, ancient forest that had once swallowed travelers whole, the old magic settled peacefully at last, watching over the beginning of something new.